Okay, let's go. This is the first slide, and this is entitled Why Do Researchers Want to Publish? Well, you've started the presentation. Now, the first thing to say is we as editors really appreciate why you want to publish. We recognise the reasons, and they're at the bottom end of this table of reasons. We realise it's really important for your career, it's really important for your colleagues, and it's really important for your department. But we as editors would really like to think that you have other reasons for publishing research, and that really is because you want to say something important, and you really want to share this important knowledge with your colleagues, both nationally and internationally. And what you want to do most of all is change practice and help patients. So those are the reasons we hope that you'll submit your work to an academic journal, in particular to a high impact journal, and of course in particular to the BMJ. Which journal should you choose? Choosing a journal is like choosing an art gallery to hang your painting. Different works of art have a home in a different art gallery. There are some very specialised art galleries and some very general. And it's the same with your work of art, and that's your academic paper. So what you really need to think of firstly is your audience. Who are you trying to talk to? Are they generalists or specialists? Is it a national or an international audience? And of course, depending on those issues, that focuses you on what journal is the best home for your paper. We're also interested in what influence, what impact this paper is going to have. Now, when we talk about impact, we mean something similar but different to what you talk about when you consider impact factor. Impact factor, of course, is the currency of academic publication. But we're interested in more than that. We're interested in the prestige of it. How big a difference does it make to healthcare? And of course, what matters in that context is who'll read your work. Will they respond to it? Will they debate? Will it create a dialogue? We really want to know, will other people be able to replicate this work? The most important thing is, will it be of use? Will it reach the public? So when you choose a journal, you need to bring all these things into consideration. And that helps you focus down on the particular home for your paper at a particular time. Editors, well, you've been introduced to us in the beginning, and we have a slightly different perspective on the academic work. We could summarise it in 3 points. We want to know, is it new, is it true, and will it help doctors make better decisions? So what does that really mean? Let's interpret that in the context of what's written on the slide. Is it new? What we really want to know, is it original? Is this new work? Now, however good your work may be, if it's replication of work that's been done elsewhere, or just underlining work that's been done in another centre, however important that is, it wouldn't necessarily be a priority for us. What we're interested in is the originality and importance of this work. We're also interested in, is it true? Now, we don't really mean there's any misconduct involved. What we really are thinking about is the method. Is this method the right method to investigate this research question? And the third point is, will it help doctors make better decisions? And that's the issue that really is the make or break for your paper. So when you read down this list of importance and originality and relevance to the audience, you can see the context of how we make those decisions. We want your paper to have a real potential to improve decision making. But we want it to be the right method. Not only that, but of course it's really important that when you're getting this method across, that you write it in a clear and concise way that your audience will understand. And of course what we really want is to make the impact. We want the paper to make a difference. You as an academic have a real interest in your subject. You have an in-depth knowledge of what you're trying to do. And you know that the work that you're doing is really, really important from an academic perspective. To be fair, as editors, and indeed on behalf of our readers, the academic interest may not be enough for us or indeed for our readers, because our readers are doctors and generally they're generalists or physicians. And it doesn't really matter whether they're practicing clinical medicine or public health or what aspect of healthcare. What we're interested in is information that we publish, that you have researched, that will, as it says on the right-hand side, help them to make better decisions. All this information, it's not a mystery. We have it all published on BMJ.com. On this slide you'll see a mock-up of what the front page of BMJ.com looks like. And circled on the bottom right hand side is some information, resources that we have available for you as authors, for our reviewers, and indeed for many of the people who are interested in what the BMJ does. Do look at this. Do mine your way down through the different levels of this information that's available, and what you'll find will be a recipe to help you do the right thing and publish the right piece of work with all the right information to keep we as editors happy. Now I've given you a general introduction to what goes on at the BMJ and the type of papers we publish and what we as editors are looking for and what we hope you as authors will produce. To give you a little bit more information and a little bit more insight and the secrets in writing the perfect research paper, I'll hand you over to my colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Loader.
Hi, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Loader. Let's start by considering sources of general guidance on writing papers. There are a lot of websites out there, but two that you might want to look at in particular are listed on this slide. The first is the website of the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. Many of the high-impact journals that you might especially want to publish your papers in conform to these requirements, and it's worth consulting them. Even if the journal you aim at doesn't use these requirements, it's still good practice to take a look at them and write your paper with them in mind. Finally, you might want to take a look at the reporting guidelines for research that are all summarized and compiled at the Equator Network Resource Center. The next slide is a screenshot of the Equator website, and you can see that they've compiled all of the guidelines that might apply to many of the different types of studies that you would be doing. You can identify guidelines for experimental studies, economic evaluations, guidelines for every type of paper. Again, even if the journal you're aiming at doesn't require you to use these guidelines, you can't go wrong consulting them because they give really helpful tips about how to organize your paper and more particularly about particular sorts of information that should be in your paper in order to impress editors and reviewers that you've done a careful job with your research. When you start to write your paper, you need to think carefully about the message that you want the paper to give to readers and the message that editors will take away from your paper when they look at it. You need to be clear in your own mind about what is the research question. Often a number of interesting findings have come up in doing the course of the research, and it can be hard to stick to the main idea that prompted you to do the research in the first place. But it's usually important to have clear in your mind, and thus clear for readers, what the main research question is that you are trying to answer. You also need to think about the article type you've chosen. Choose the right format for your study and report it in that way. And finally, think about the end user, the audience that's going to be reading your paper, clinicians, researchers, or policymakers, and aim your writing at them. Journals differ with regard to what they want for a title. If you take a look at the journal you're interested in, you'll see that most of them have styles for titles. It's useful to write your title in a style that conforms to that used by the journal. Take a careful look at their instructions to authors and look at other articles in that journal. There are many different ways to present your title, and the way you do it will depend a lot on the journal that you're aiming at and also what you want to convey to readers. You can see here a number of ways in which you might want to indicate the study design that you've used in the title of your paper. This is especially helpful because it immediately signals to editors the sort of paper they'll be dealing with. And more importantly, for casual users, perhaps doing a Medline search, it's very helpful to know what sort of study they're going to encounter if they pull up the full paper. You can see here a list of titles of BMJ articles. You can tell, I think, from perusing this that the BMJ has a preference for a descriptive sort of title, including the study design. The BMJ and many other research journals prefer that you organize your paper following the IMRAD approach: introduction, methods, results, and discussion. In the introduction, you should briefly review why you've asked this particular research question. The methods section, which I'll go into detail about in a few minutes, should describe very clearly what you did, perhaps in a way that's detailed enough that other people or researchers could replicate your study. The results section should clearly describe what you've found, and in the discussion section, you're allowed to speculate a bit about what it all might mean. On this slide, we'll go into a bit more detail about the introduction. It should be brief, and it should be written with your audience in mind. They may not be specialists in the area of your research, so you do need to describe for them what's known and what is unknown about your research question. But don't bore people by going into detail about things that are only going to interest specialists or other people who aren't the major audience for your paper. The research question does need to be stated clearly, and you need to make people understand why it matters. From an editor's point of view, and also that of reviewers, the methods section is the most important part. It's often like a recipe. There are certain things that need to be included, and in particular, you need to be very clear about the inclusion and exclusion criteria for any subjects or participants in your study. You need to clearly describe the outcome measures, the intervention or exposure, and go into great detail about how they were determined. You also need to give references if you've used particular instruments or methods. And again, you should follow reporting guidelines and explain ethical issues. This slide provides information on how you might want to organize the results section of your paper and the information you might want to include. Basic descriptive data is really important. Instead of simply providing percentages, for example, you should give numerators and denominators. Tables and figures are helpful to illustrate things, but in general you don't want to repeat too much in the text what is in the tables, or vice versa. Confidence intervals are essential to help readers interpret your results, and summary statistics that are helpful to readers and other end users are important to include as well. You can leave out non-essential tables and figures, or you might want to include them in appendices or other web extras. Also, this is not a place to begin your discussion. It's often tempting to do so when you're presenting particularly provocative or unexpected results, but that belongs in the discussion section. This slide lists some essential summary statistics. You can see that they differ depending on the study design. For example, in a cohort study, we'll be looking to see if you've included information on relative risk reduction, absolute event rates, and the time for exposed and non-exposed groups. You can find these summary statistics and recommendations about when and where they should be applied in many of the reporting guidelines for your study type. Here are some general tips on ways to make your articles more evidence-based. This slide is a screenshot of information on the BMJ website. This slide covers things to consider in the structured discussion of your paper. In general, you should avoid repeating information that you've already introduced in the early part of the paper, but you do want to summarize your principal findings, and this is the right place to discuss the strengths and limitations of your study. You should be cautious about drawing conclusions that aren't firmly based on the findings in your study. You certainly can speculate on the meaning of the study, in particular what it might mean to clinicians, policymakers, or patients, and you can talk a bit about unanswered questions in future research that might be prompted by your findings. This slide covers general rules for writing an abstract. Although it's often written last after the rest of the paper is finished, don't let it be an afterthought. It's very important. Many journals, including the BMJ, allow editors to screen using only the abstract. Make sure that all authors involved with the paper have seen and approved the abstract, and in general it's wise to avoid letting a junior member of the team write the abstract because it is so important. When you revise a paper in response to requests from editors or reviewers, make sure to revise the abstract as well. This slide contains information on what should be included in a structured abstract. Many journals do require that the abstract follow a certain format. Here you see the format preferred by the BMJ. Make sure to consult instructions for authors. All research articles accepted by the BMJ are published in full on bmj.com with open access and no word limits. If we accept your research article, you can opt for online-only publication or for a Pico version in the print journal. The templates for the Pico version are available on bmj.com, and you can see illustrated here a Pico version of one of our recent research articles. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Trish Groves to talk about trial registration and ethical issues.
Hello, I'm Trish Groves. If you have conducted a clinical trial and your paper is reporting that trial, then journals will be looking out for information about the trial's registration. Trial registration is required by all the journals who follow the rules of the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, and the BMJ is one of those journals. You'll see here on this slide the rules about clinical trial registration. But the bottom line is that your trial should have been registered before it actually started and before you started enrolling participants into the trial. You'll see that the rules came in rather gradually over the past few years, and that there are some specific rules that apply to one kind of trial or another. So I hope that this slide will help you understand that, but if you have any doubts at all, please visit our resources for authors on bmj.com, where the policy is explained in full. And if you have any remaining doubts, then please go to the website of the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. In the last slide, I talked a bit about the general rules on trial registration and the need to have your trial registered before it starts, before you're going to get it published in a journal that follows the rules of the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. Another important aspect of clinical trial registration is that it is now required by some legislators. And particularly in the US, if your clinical trial was of a product that needs approval by the US Food and Drug Administration, then your trial must have been registered before it started, and within a year of seeing the last participant in the trial, the results of the trial have to be posted on the main US clinical trial registry, which is clinicaltrials.gov. So this slide explains that briefly, but if you have any doubts at all, then please go to our resources for authors for more information. The next slide tells you a little bit more about the FDA Amendment Act, and specifically which results have to be posted online when at clinicaltrials.gov. You'll see that when the law first came in, the first requirement was that there should be 2 tables giving the results for the main outcome measures. Gradually, the FDA expects more information to be added to the registry entry for each clinical trial. So 2 tables of harms now have to be added, and it's possible that from 2010 it'll also be necessary to provide a summary of the results for a non-medical, non-specialist audience, really for members of the public and for patients who might be interested in the trial because they may have the condition that the trial was relevant to. However, this is out for consultation, and there are, as yet, no clear decisions on what this lay summary should include. So if you're in any doubt, keep an eye on clinicaltrials.gov and see what rules are appearing there over time. This slide shows that this isn't just a law that you have to follow, it's a law that if you don't follow, you get into big trouble. And if you make one mistake and don't follow this law properly, you can be fined $10,000 for one mistake. And if you make 10 mistakes, you're in big trouble financially. Now, this doesn't mean that you make a little mistake when you're entering your information about your trial in clinicaltrials.gov. It means if you don't follow the rules and you don't put your results up on the website within a year of seeing the last patient. So it's about that kind of error or negligence, if you like. It's not about making small mistakes in the information that you enter. Right, now we're moving on to talking about publication ethics. Now, as a researcher, you know about the ethics of doing research and how important it is to make sure that if you've got people entering your studies, that they have given fully informed consent and that you've considered all kinds of ethical considerations while you're actually planning and conducting your study. But there are also ethical considerations around getting your work published. And it's sometimes very confusing to unpick all of these issues, so we've tried to pull them all together in one place on the BMJ's website, bmj.com. The slide shows the web link for our transparency policy, and we hope that you'll find this helpful. Now, as editors, we're very interested in whether or not your study was conducted ethically. Now, that doesn't just mean that you have to say that the study was approved by an institutional review board or an ethics committee. We hope that the board will have done a great job in assessing the ethical dimensions of your study. And of course it is extremely important to get that approval and to include that information in your paper. But we're also thinking about other ethical issues. So for instance, if you did something in your study that really wasn't very close to normal clinical practice, and therefore the participants took extra risks or even had to spend quite a lot of time coming up to the hospital for extra tests, or perhaps couldn't avoid feeling rather anxious during your study, we need you to think about this, and we really need you to discuss it in your paper, because it shows that you conducted your study with all due care and with all due respect to the participants. Now, there's always a balance of risks and benefits in these sort of situations, so we hope that in the discussion section of your paper you will at least briefly discuss the balance of risks and benefits to the people in your study, and also, if relevant, to other patients and perhaps to wider society. But as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, in your discussion section, we don't want you to go too far beyond what you actually did. Nevertheless, these are things we'd like you to think about throughout the writing of your paper. We want to know every aspect of whether or not your work was ethical. Another important thing to think about is who did what in the study and how you explain that in your paper. Now, as editors, we know very well that researchers are only human, and like all humans, they sometimes fall out with each other. And it's surprisingly common for researchers who start off as friends and colleagues to end up as enemies. And we do, unfortunately, hear quite often about work where a paper has been submitted and there is some kind of argument going on between the authors. In very bad cases, this can mean that an author's name may actually be removed from the paper, even though they did a lot of work in the study and also drafted the paper initially. So it's very important, before you even start your study, that you work out between you who are going to be the authors, and there's also that sticky problem of what order their names should go in. As editors, we can't really advise you on that, and you need to work that out and agree it all in writing before you even start your study. When it comes to the paper, here at the BMJ, we want to know who the authors were, but we also want to know about other people who may have contributed to the research, and we hope that you will credit them properly in the paper, which I'll explain in a few minutes. We also want to know about conflicts of interest that may be relevant to your work and need to be explained in your paper. At the BMJ, we prefer to use the term competing interest because conflict somehow sounds rather pejorative. It sounds like you've done something bad, and many people have conflicts and they're not always bad. So we feel that what we're interested in is interests around the work that may in some way compete with the work and may open it up to some kind of bias. We want you to be honest and open in reporting these things. Now, first of all, how do you define an author? It's surprisingly difficult. If it's a novel, you'd think that's fairly straightforward because the author is the person who wrote the book. Having said that, we all know about books written by celebrities that have not been written by those celebrities but have been written by professional writers, and their names often don't appear on the book at all. Now, with scientific research, it really matters whose name is included as an author, because the author's names appear in the byline at the top of the paper. They appear in bibliographic indexes like Medline, and really importantly, if you're listed as the author on a published paper, then of course you can add that to your curriculum vitae or resume, and you can use it when you're trying to go for a new job and advance your career. So it's important that the people who are listed as authors really were authors. And the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors has tried to come up with a definition of authorship that gives proper credit to the people who did the work. Now, it isn't perfect, and it's here on this slide, but the important bits are here in bold. To be an author, you need to have made a substantial contribution to these things. And the underlined words or and are very important too. So read this very, very carefully. And if, when it comes to writing up your paper, somebody says, I should be an author on this paper, and you think, hang on, you have not actually fulfilled these criteria, then you can show them the criteria and say, I'm really sorry, but we're going to get into trouble. The journal is going to say, actually, that we can't list you as an author, but we can list you in another way, and I'll come on to that in a moment. So here in this next slide, we talk about the other way that it's possible to acknowledge the contributions of other people involved in your research study. A few journals have an actual explicit statement called the Contributorship statement, and the BMJ is one of those journals. So we expect you to include a contributorship statement on every research paper that you submit to the BMJ. Other journals don't necessarily use this, but they usually allow you to give some acknowledgements, and that's where you should put this information if the journal you're submitting your work to doesn't actually ask for a formal contributorship statement. So you include here all the people who are also listed as authors, but you may be able to include here some other people who didn't count as authors because they collected data but they weren't involved in designing the study, or they weren't involved in drafting the article or revising it critically. So here you can include anybody who you feel really did contribute and made the work happen. Another thing we ask for in the contributorship statement is the name of one or more guarantors. And the point about a guarantor is the person who can stand up and defend the work and can say, yes, I can guarantee that this work was done, and that it was done to the best of our ability and to the highest possible standard. And the guarantor needs to also be able to ensure that everybody had access to the data in the study, and that everybody who's listed as an author controlled the decision to publish. So the guarantor, or guarantors if you choose to have more than one, is the person who takes responsibility for all of that. Don't take on this responsibility if you really can't guarantee all of those things. The next slide shows an example from a published BMJ paper. Now, what's missing from here is the paper, but what you've got is the list of authors whose names appeared at the top of the paper, and you've also got the contributorship statement that appeared at the bottom of the paper. And I'll leave you to have a look, but you'll see that all the authors are mentioned in the contributorship statement, but there are also a few other people who pop in there who weren't actually authors. And this statement explains quite clearly what those additional people did. So we've talked a bit about publication ethics. Now we get on to the bit that people often find most interesting and in some ways most worrying, when there's genuine bad behaviour and scientific misconduct. Now here is a quote from a former editor of Nature, and he makes the point that actually we may think as scientists and researchers that we should be above all these things, but in the end we're human, and some scientists and researchers, I'm afraid, are more human than others. So what do we mean by research misconduct? Well, here is a definition used by the Office of Research Integrity in the US, and it does sum up pretty clearly what editors and reviewers and ethicists would consider to be research misconduct. On this next slide are the results of a survey of scientists that was published in Nature. Now, the circle there shows how commonly people admitted to using someone else's ideas without obtaining their permission or giving them due credit. And actually, it was reasonably frequent. So, well, only maybe 1.7% of mid-career researchers admitted to this, but when you see that the sample size was well over 3,000 scientists, that's actually quite a lot of people. And this table does have some really quite shocking findings, really. This next slide introduces an interesting piece of software, which is a new tool to detect plagiarism, the appropriation of another person's ideas, results, processes or words without giving them appropriate credit. There are already quite a lot of web resources which are free, which can be used to check whether or not something has already appeared before in a formal publication or indeed anywhere on the web. The problem with these other tools, though, is that they can't pick up articles that have been published in scholarly journals that are only available to subscribers, or what we would say were behind access controls. This tool, however, CrossCheck, is able to get behind those access controls and is able to research more than 9 billion articles in a database of publications. And this next slide shows how CrossCheck works. It uses a specialist search engine called Authenticate, and you will see here on the screen two sections of two different articles. On the left-hand side is an article that has been submitted to a journal. And on the right-hand side is an article that's been published somewhere else before. And the software says that between these two articles there was a 60% match. And in fact, in terms of overall similarity, if you looked at the whole article, there was up to 71% overlap. And so this tool spotted that actually these two articles were extremely similar. What the tool can't do is decide whether that's okay or not. Now, there are some situations where it's fine to use the same wording that somebody else has used. For instance, if you're describing some laboratory technique for which there's really only one reasonable description, something like that. Or indeed, if you have done a large body of research and you have written several papers reporting that research, it's often reasonable for you to use roughly the same wording, say, in the methods section, at least in some general sense. Clearly, your separate articles should report separate aspects of the study, but inevitably there will be some overlapping text, and that's all right. So what this CrossCheck tool does, using this Authenticate search engine, is it flags up overlap and it gives it a percentage, but it's then up to the editor to have a look at that overlap and decide whether or not it looks as if it was acceptable overlap or it was unacceptable overlap and it was clearly stealing somebody else's work and not attributing it properly. So on the one hand, the internet makes it much easier to copy other people's work than used to be the case, because it's so easy to find other people's work and to just copy and paste. On the other hand, the internet is making it more and more easy to spot plagiarism. So what do editors do if they either suspect or discover that there has been some misconduct, either in terms of actually doing the research or in publishing it? As editors, we manage the peer review process, and actually peer review itself has not proved yet to be terribly good at picking up research fraud. If somebody has completely fabricated their study or has completely fabricated some of the results, that's quite hard for a peer reviewer or editor to spot, unless they've done it very, very badly. Or perhaps if they've done it too perfectly, because of course real life is messy and real science is messy, and studies that are too good to be true occasionally are too good to be true because they've been fabricated. However, as I said, peer review is not great at spotting this. However, as editors, we do sometimes think, this doesn't seem quite right. Or occasionally we receive a letter or email from somebody who says, I'm aware that you're considering this work at the moment, and I must warn you that I have concerns about some misconduct. Now, we wouldn't accept that sort of email from just anybody, and we want them to provide some reasonable evidence, because of course they could just be someone who doesn't like the author and is trying to ruin their reputation. So although we take these sorts of letters seriously, we do some investigation before we do anything about them. However, if we do decide that there seems to have been some misconduct, then we first of all contact the authors and ask them for an explanation. If we feel that there's actually been a problem either with the data, that they were perhaps fabricated, or they've been reported in such a way that it was dishonest, we will sometimes ask the authors to provide the raw data from their study, and we will send those to a statistician and ask them to look for any evidence of fraud. And there are statistical techniques for detecting fraud, because fraudulent data often come out in patterns that show that they were not spontaneously scientifically produced. If the authors don't respond to our inquiries or don't respond in a way that reassures us, then we do quite often contact the author's institution. So that might be their university, their boss. If the author is a practicing doctor and we've got good evidence that they have misbehaved in one of these ways, then we may contact the licensing body that operates in their country and say, we've serious concerns about this person's work and you may want to consider their license. We also get help from two bodies. One is the Committee on Publication Ethics, or COPE, which is an international body that advises editors on cases of possible misconduct. COPE looks at cases that have been anonymised, so the people involved at COPE don't actually know who the authors were. The BMJ also has its own ethics committee, and we quite often seek their advice too when we feel that there has been an ethics problem around either the conduct of research or the way it has been reported in a paper. If all of these investigations do result in a pretty definite case of misconduct, then the journal may well publish a note of concern on the journal website next to the article, and this will also be published in Medline. If there's absolutely definite evidence, then the article will be retracted by the editors from their journal, retracted and taken down from the website, and although the article will remain on bibliographic indexes like Medline, there will be a retraction notice there forever, so that anybody going to the article will be able to see that the article has been retracted by the journal and can see why. Now we get to the really important part of the presentation. How are you going to please the editors, reviewers, and how are you going to increase the chances that your work will be accepted? Well, we hope that everything we've said so far in this presentation will already have given you lots of tips and clues on how you can do this, but I'll just recap. Before you start your study, make sure you have a really clear research question. Don't just go to your routine data about patients who you've been seeing, to their medical records, look around, gather some statistics, and then try and think of a research study. If you do that, you will not have a clear research question and you won't end up with a good paper, and it'll be very hard to get it published. You do need to sit down, do a bit of background reading, preferably a search in a library, and actually come up with something that you want answered, and then you need to design a study to answer that question. And before you start, if you can, get the help of a professional statistician or brush up your own statistical skills, because it's too late when you've done your study and you're gathering together all your data and trying to write your paper. It's too late then to try and make something good out of a mess. It's much better if you've thought in advance about the design and about the statistical analysis that you would need to do to make sense of your findings. And most importantly, you need to think statistically when you're deciding how many participants to include in your study. You need to be looking for a particular result, and you need to have enough participants to do that. So you need to determine your sample size. Once you've done all this, you need to keep an open mind through your study while you're doing your study, and you also need to think of ways to try and avoid or cut down any risk of bias. Also, before you start your study, you need to think about who's going to be the principal investigator or lead author, and as I mentioned earlier, you need to work out who are going to be the authors, who are going to be the contributors. And another very important thing from the ethical point of view is that you need to agree between you that even if your study doesn't work out how you wanted and you don't get the finding you wanted, and actually you were looking for an association between A and B, or you were hoping that an intervention, such as a new treatment, would work, you find out that actually it doesn't work, or there isn't an association and your findings are negative. Well, you should still try and get that study published. And these days editors are trained to be just as interested in negative results as they are in positive results, because they're often really important. It's important to know that new things don't work. So how do you please the editors? Well, quite apart from doing fantastic research and writing a beautiful paper, try and choose the right journal, because if you've chosen the wrong journal, it's going to waste your time, but it's also going to waste the editors. Make sure you read the journals before you make your decision. Follow the advice to authors when you're writing your paper. If you know you're aiming for a particular journal, then actually have a look at their instructions for authors and follow them, and the editors will be pretty pleased. Many journals nowadays expect you to submit online, and that's the case at the BMJ. Our submission website is called, quite simply, submit.bmj.com. And while you're there, follow the instructions. They're usually quite straightforward, and it does mean that this way your article will arrive in good shape and will arrive by the right route, and that will mean that the editors are feeling pretty happy when they first see your submission. So once the editors have got your article, what do they want to know? Well, they want to know that there's a really nice clear message in your research paper and in the abstract, and not just in the covering letter. Time and time again as editors we see a really nice clear covering letter which makes it obvious why the authors have chosen our journal and why they think that their work is important and needs publishing. But it's often not so clear in the paper. It's really important that the paper speaks for itself, so make sure that your introduction and discussion do a good job of explaining the importance, the originality and the relevance of your message. If the journal you're submitting to wants you to include particular reporting statements such as Strobe or Consort or Prisma, then please make sure that you submit with your paper the appropriate checklist and flowchart. These show more information about your study and how it was conducted, and they help editors and reviewers navigate their way around your paper. If you've got some very similar work, very similar papers from the same study that have been published somewhere else or have been submitted somewhere else, then please tell us about those and also include them in your submission. You can send them as supplemental files when you're submitting to the BMJ's submission website. And this is really helpful because it helps us to see what this particular paper you have sent us is adding and why it's important. It's also very common for you to try several journals in a row, and the first few journals say, no, sorry, your work isn't quite right for our journal. And some of those may have sent your article out for peer review. Now, hopefully, you will have used that peer review to help you improve your paper and make it clearer and more detailed. If that's the case, it's really helpful for us at the BMJ to know that your work has been previously reviewed, and it's great for us to see how you've improved the paper in response to those reviewers' reports. Even better, we really like to see your responses to those reviewers' reports. So, for instance, you would say, well, the reviewers at the previous journal suggested that we did this new analysis and we've done it. Another thing that editors and peer reviewers really like is that you correspond with them nice and efficiently. So if the editors write to you, then try and reply quite quickly, even if it's a sort of holding email to say, I need to speak to my other authors, but 2 of them are away for a month. We'll get back to you as soon as possible. Just keep in touch and be as communicative as you can, and that'll be much appreciated. Not all journals want you to phone the editors because often the editors may be out and about. Often they have clinical jobs or research jobs themselves, and they may not always be on the same phone number. So you can try phoning journals, but often it's better to email because email can be picked up anywhere, anytime, and editors often find that a much easier form of communication. It also means that you can very clearly express what you're trying to say, and that conversation you're having with them can be kept and referred to later, which is also useful if there are any misunderstandings or any details that need capturing in some way. Okay, we're nearly at the end now. When you send your article to a journal, it kind of disappears and you think, well, I've just got to sit here quietly and wait for a decision. You really have no idea what's going on behind the doors of that journal. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happens during peer review at the BMJ for research papers. Well, we're a bit unusual at the BMJ because we not only tell our reviewers who has written the papers, but we also tell you, as an author, who has reviewed your work. So all the reviewers that we use sign their reports and they declare any competing interests that they may have that are relevant to your paper. So you will receive a peer reviewer's report and you will know who it's come from. Now, I say that, but not all of the articles that we consider do get sent out to peer reviewers, and I'll explain that in a minute. Reviewers at the BMJ advise us as editors, but we make the final decision, and we have an editorial committee that helps us do that. Other journals, particularly smaller and more specialist journals, do not have full-time editors, and they rely very heavily on their peer reviewers to help make the decisions. And indeed, many journals will send articles to maybe 3 reviewers, and if 2 reviewers say, yes, this is a good paper for this journal, then they'll accept the article on that basis. At the bigger journals, including the BMJ, the editors tend to be full-time and tend to be the decision makers, but advised, very much advised by reviewers. This slide gives an overview of the peer review process we have. We get about 8,000 manuscripts every year at the BMJ, but they're not all original research papers. Some of them are essays, analysis articles, editorials, and that kind of thing. When it comes to research, we receive up to 5,000 papers a year. Now, they're read usually on the day of submission by an editor who is sitting there waiting for that day's new submissions. So I'm afraid it does mean that it's entirely possible for you to submit your paper online to the BMJ at 10 o'clock in the morning and to receive a rejection letter by 11 o'clock that same morning. Now, that doesn't mean the editor hasn't looked at your work carefully. It means that they were there ready and waiting and looked at it as soon as it came in. Now, that first editor will look for the things we've already talked about in this presentation. They'll be thinking about the research question, its importance, relevance and originality, and whether the right methods were used in the study, and whether the paper clearly describes all of that. And if that first editor feels that the paper really isn't right for the BMJ, or more to the point, the BMJ really isn't the right journal for your work, then they will tell you that, but they'll usually send it to a second editor just to be sure and to get a second opinion. There are a few articles every year which really aren't for the BMJ because they may be very specialised. And for those, the first editor will often say so very quickly and not bother to get a second opinion. The reason we do this so quickly is, firstly, because we do have many manuscripts and we don't want to delay our work, but far more importantly, we don't want to waste your time. It's always horrible having your work rejected by a journal, but it's much worse if that rejection comes after many weeks or even months. So if we're really sure that the BMJ is not the right journal, we'll tell you as quickly as we can, and we hope that you find that a useful service once you've got over the shock. Now, for the articles that the first editor and perhaps the second editor think might be right for the BMJ and the BMJ's readers, then these articles get sent to a more senior screening editor. And that screening editor, again, looks every single day at the papers that have been sent online by the first couple of editors. And the screener, again, focuses very hard on the research question and whether it's been answered in the best possible way. You'll notice that up to this point, we're far less interested in the answer. So although results are of course very important, we really won't turn down your work just because the results are negative. As long as they were truly negative, you used the right methods and enough statistical power, and you found that there was genuinely no association between A and B, or genuinely no benefit from this new intervention, well then that's an important finding, and we will continue considering your paper if it's relevant to our readers. You'll see that about 4,000 papers get rejected at this stage, so by this stage most of the papers have been rejected. But about 1,000 every year go out for external peer review, and when they come back from the reviewers, some of those are rejected, up to about half, because the reviewers, who are experts in the field, have said, well, actually there are problems with this paper. It may be that there are scientific problems, or there may be just a mismatch between the science and the choice of journal. And the reviewers will often say to us, actually this really is a point just for specialists. Or they may say, this really isn't very new, and we don't think that this should be a high priority for the BMJ. And as editors, of course, we find that kind of advice extremely helpful. The papers that survive all of that go to a weekly editorial meeting, which is attended by the editor, the entire research team, an external editorial advisor, who is usually a clinician, a statistical editor. So that's a pretty important meeting, and we usually discuss 12 research papers a week at that meeting, and we consider them carefully, and we've all read them in advance. And we look there, not just at the paper, but we look at any supplementary information that you may have sent. So, for instance, if you've submitted a clinical trial, we'll look at the protocol, we'll look at the consort checklist. We may well have checked the registration information as well. And if all goes well and we accept your paper, then we'll publish it. And as Elizabeth mentioned earlier on, we publish all research papers that are accepted by the BMJ on bmj.com with open access and with no word limits. If you opt for print publication in the print BMJ, then we'll ask you to shorten the paper, as Elizabeth mentioned, and we'll quite often commission an editorial to go with your paper to help put it in context for our readers. So the reviewers at the BMJ, we very much encourage them to be as open and honest as they can, and as I've said, they sign their reports, but we also want them to be as constructive as possible, and we make this pretty clear in our instructions to the reviewers. Even if a paper reports a study that may not have been the most perfect study in the world. We hope that the reviewers will give advice that will help the authors, help you, to make the very best of your paper, to report it as clearly as possible, and maybe find the right journal for it. But most importantly, we want reviewers to tell us about originality and importance, because they're working in the same field as you and they know what's new and what's really important. Lastly, some journals say, well, you've submitted your work to us, we've had a good look, and sorry, we don't think it's right, so please go away. And they don't want to hear from you again. But many journals do have an appeals process, and the BMJ welcomes appeals. If your paper has been rejected after peer review and maybe after the editorial committee, you'll have a lot of information that will help you revise the paper, and you may well feel that we've made a mistake and that you can revise the paper and come back to us and say, you really ought to reconsider. Perhaps we weren't clear enough, but now, with this nice new revised paper, we've been able to answer all your questions and it's a lot better now. Please have another look at it. Sometimes you may feel that you need to appeal right at the beginning of the process. If we've rejected your paper very quickly, very soon after submission, you may feel that we've made a mistake because we've misunderstood something. So again, there's no harm in trying to appeal, but it does tend to be those appeals at the later stages where they're very serious appeals and the authors have been able to make a lot of changes to the paper. They're the ones that tend to succeed. If it's simply that you feel we've been unkind or have not understood how important your work is, we may not agree with you still, but it's worth a try. Now, you only get one chance to an appeal. We don't want to have a long conversation where you're begging and we're saying no, oh, all right then, because that usually doesn't work out very well for any of us. So if you are going to appeal, please make it good, because it's your one shot at it. And the first thing you need to do is to go back to your paper in our submission system. So you go back to submit.bmj.com, to your author area, and you look up your paper, and there's something there that you can click on to start the appeals process. And all we want initially is a detailed letter explaining why you want to appeal and on what grounds. And that will be considered by the editor who saw your paper and handled your paper, but also by another editor who hasn't seen the paper before and brings a fresh opinion. And if we think you've got a good case, then we'll invite you to submit a revised paper and we'll take it from there. So, good luck. We do actually publish quite a lot of articles after appeals, and it's always worth it if you genuinely feel that we've not given you a fair enough chance or have not really understood your work fully. And lastly, thank you very much for staying with us through this quite long presentation, and we look forward to seeing your papers and we hope that you'll succeed.